아기 우중어다 튜메 투모와 남기진바 제바텔라다 알겠습니다. 삼바중앙에 세딜마는 지현되다 그제 셀링아 주게 지와 마덴비기에 지와 잼바제 마군비기 님이 괜된 지어래서다. 근데 곰비기 지와 곰비기엔 곰비기 판연된데 요래서 근데 내 지와 잼비기 로 간스실에 깨베 새로지 간스에서 디시 근데 모두 쉬나마 되다. 근데 지와 잼비 곰비기 곰난 간스 곰고래시 사실 마선의 시로시 모두 쉬네는 되게 디시로와
Good evening. Last weekend, in the final session, we came to the actual trainings that are shared with a practitioner of initial capacity. And we've come to the chapter on death and future lives, and we're looking at the practice of being mindful of our death or the impermanence of this life. So at the bottom of the published book of page 79, and at the beginning of the handout, we have the four outlines that this chapter is divided in. Firstly, where we just started last week, the fault of not cultivating mindfulness of death. Secondly, the benefits of cultivating mindfulness of death. Thirdly, what kind of mindfulness of death should be generated. And then fourthly, how to cultivate mindfulness of death.
나는 저기 지와말 전바다 마군비 님이세데 균인의 쇼레세 모트식으로 당하는 섬나야 넘기는 것도 섬로 간에서 코고레세네 나가서 섬다하 섬로야 코르다마 디순고로와 디네자 델리아 그송고랑 섬나나 가려요스네 대시 타 치와지 옹년비 군라이스 세상을 섬나야 수리네 미치 시그레스 섬로 딩을 찾아서 요레스 그러다 요레스 자 이내다 니머리시 미시 데링 미시 선배 데링 미시 상이 미시 데링 니머리다 아이 시그마레 선배 삼로도 예리 말에 디자 데네자 삼로 데니시 코고레스 제가 당하고 삼로 나라 멍치 미시위 초도 로디 미시위 초디 안에 숙제요 그래 시위 삼로도 시장요 말 미시위 소도 기디네 지게레트야 셔거래시 로 미시위 초 진바디 마시 춘체로 치가 춘체로 지루어지대 되네게 삼로도 요래 해서지 기생한테 디바도 쉬사로다.
The published book at the top of page 80 and in the handout, the middle page 90. This is where we started last week, looking at the faults of not cultivating mindfulness of death. So this is the first outline within this chapter. And one first looks at the faults of not being mindful of death because it is such a grave barrier to us being able to fully and wholeheartedly engage in the Dharma. So we looked at the first point. Although we all have the thought that at the end of our life, we will come out of death. The end of our life will come our death. Each day we think, I will not die today. And today, too, I will not die. So this is an underlying assumption with which we carry and which pervades all that we do. This feeling that we have time, that I will not die, and I will not die for quite some length of time. And Lama Tsongkhapa continues, in this way, right up to when we are about to die, our mind holds on to the idea that we are not going to die. So even when our death is actually close, there is still this disbelief, this thought that there is still time. There's this ongoing, underlying feeling that my end is still a way off.
예, 나디 그냥 좀 나라 되니시 고고래 생각도 미리 삼을 되니시 땡고래 생각들이야. 되네 여러 숨고를 와디 이거네 덴바르 와다 가서 시기리에서 나도 시기리에서 몇 삼로 줘야 돼. 와. 이내는 가서 디린 시기 말해서 비게 삼로 안 상이 되는 진지 신녀마딘 나니 되는 시기 제ля가지 안 체시라디 That's only the image that the do in some that never a jacale have was in manga on the sure the nursing mother and never draws on teaching something to call you. You mean is that they are doing to the chatter at the Munina, and some quarter in school or rest of Chigo and go what I did.
What's presented here, we know is actually true from our own lived experience. This is how we think. We accept our eventual death. No one denies that death will eventually come for each of us. But we have this innate sense that we will always be here. Even though we don't explicitly think, I won't die, there's this underlying feeling that it will probably be a long time before I die. And this is something we've had throughout the entirety of our life and will continue even when we are faced with our impending death, when we receive a terrible diagnosis or when we are in hospital in a grave situation. There's still the thought that there is a bit more time. The grave fault of not being mindful of our potential imminent death is that it keeps our mind far from the Dharma. This is the grave fault. Hence, this is the first outline that we look at.
Dungal set up bashi, sem ne, sechima, tarbada, tamje kemba, so den chembola, jubu, lumi gebe, chela, judu, medirlas.
So now, turning again to the text. If you do not take to heart an antidote to this, if your mind is obscured by such an idea and you think that you will remain in this life, then you will keep thinking about ways of achieving happiness and eliminating suffering in this life only, thinking, I need such and such. A mind analyzing meaningful goals such as future lives, liberation, and omniscience will not arise. Thus, no opportunity will be created for engaging in Dharma.
Shiga Tunshele, Shigmare, Sembe Samlo Delea, and the Nimbo Tingu, Nimbo Tingu Horish, is that the Nimbo Matimba Shavana, Menesha, and Digi Garson, Lodi, Dedabu, Louis, Tipney, the Nigu Lodi Pachi, getting that the Samlo lady do, and Digi Tipney and the Carjo Tips and Digi Park Arch and the church, Samlo de Litugo Malaysia. She's on Delia, Nimbo Tingu Horish. She's a Nimbo Matimba Shavana, did not really get a child. She's a Nimbo Matimba, Dilo de Gedina, the lady when dinner the treaty, Jackie, some of the Ligoma, she's a deep tipsy tipakaji, Gago, etc. She's a deep tip near the Nimbo Yile Majeba, dead I will tip and tip na, so the Tiguration.
Looking at the first sentence, where if your mind, just moving on a little bit, if your mind is obscured by such an idea, the idea being that you think that you will remain in this life. So this thought that I won't die today, and in fact, this I won't die today, what's underlying it is this innate sense that actually nor tomorrow, nor this year, maybe not even this decade, this innate feeling that we have an immensity of time, and that this is perpetually our underlying assumption with which we move through life. This is what obscures our mind, this obstruction referred to in this first sentence. And what does it obstruct? It obstructs us achieving the potential of this precious human rebirth. This precious human rebirth, which has such great value, such great potential. It is this failure to recognize our potential ending of this life that obstructs us accomplishing anything more than merely Dharma imprints in this life, not fulfilling our potential and actually cultivating minds of the Dharma within, gaining realization of the Dharma.
Denigi lo digi gypsy that denigi chiwi machi shigmare sempe samlodi denigi yoda digi shuk digi gypsy and chiwi sambas chuje samlodi letugo mares. De male and some garligo or sene dene sediru debig lo kienes didandi quesos. And just so settle mashiva you de samlogi gates and nanzuga. Malia Jalalmas and Digo to Yagalmas and Dicio and Jema Dicio, the Dicio, the Chichimakurachi, Dingo, what I was doing in those Chichigor, which is some of the Lady Tenigita, because Bendigo would Che Majembache, Sedizam ye, so take you to the Dumase, Sedizam ye, and to Tondalea, Maticio to Dicio, Jesadin Lukine, did a Dicio to say. She said this Dewa Tubata Dunga Sevi Tabla Sem Dinekidina di some corregeta, do send some jelly or reason to do the age in its sort of regeta. Reading from the text. If you do not take to your heart an antidote to this, if your life is obscured by such an idea and you think that you will remain in this life, then you will keep thinking about ways of achieving happiness and eliminating suffering in this life only, thinking, I need such and such. So this is a key fault of not being mindful of death. It's due to the consistency of this underlying belief that I won't die anytime soon, that prevents us from accomplishing the Dharma within. And rather, our mind remains, as it has been up to now, dominated by achieving or fulfilling our ambitions, our desires. I want this, I don't want that. Thereby, our mind remains dominated by achieving this life's mere pleasures and overcoming this life's minor problems. This ends up with our mind staying narrow and tight, easily annoyed and frustrated. This is a grave fault of not being mindful of death. Odanga Lobsang Dorje, that teacher Lobsang Dorje, Jema Lagarag Marisa, that the near some that she Lobsang Dorje, that and is Lagalea, that didn't Lagadem, and is Lagalea to Digi, the Lagam Malevena, Janji Saya to Yada, Twinkie Kana, Chigua, Dikanga say, Tundala, and Chigi Lagalea, and then dig on Dileajikan, Paso Joya, Kanga Chidi, touching motor to say that they are dinner some that. What do Shana do Shen? Ya, Taro Kurja, the Niaji, Michi. So Mijay no integrate, then a boot, get a boot on the boot, he'll up down, Consulia do, then it can watch another chick, do Sina, and Dene, not so to what I did many ways that child, what I wanted.
This, when we look back at our mind over the course of this life, and certainly right up to this point, we see how our mind is dominated by thoughts of, I want this and I don't want that, in relation to mere experiences of this life, nothing beyond this life. So we can think back to when we were younger and we are thinking what interests us, what career we want to go into, what training and education we need to achieve. And why do we need this career and this education? Because I want a job that pays okay, so that I earn a decent salary and I don't struggle to get by. And then one starts one's career, but in order to get to one's place of work, one needs a car. Later, one needs a nicer car. And then perhaps if one's doing better, one needs a car to match one's status. And this is the case for all our possessions, always looking for something newer, something more impressive. And in this way, our time and our energy is consumed. And then when we're a bit older, we start a family. And then now, because our responsibilities are so much broader, we have our children to care for. Our needs, our wants, our desires are that much broader. And our entire life gets consumed in terms of achieving this life's mere pleasures and overcoming this life's minor problems.
Denegi samlu koraje du jene samlu kor dene lega leji de ane karji orse de jesa dini samda de manzo nodri chagore se de gyuen ro chagore je de karasene dine samda de dine gaso karjingi omarasne sechima dang tarba dang tamje kemba soge duen chenbo jubu lo mikiwe chele juba midere dine jesa den cheti dam yedigi rubya de dunga sa du chenamya dine samda je lega leji ne 디스 조어시네 개와치마 원류 주비에 고바토에 don달이야 너는 가서 개와사 구세고 말에 근데 멤버가 고여 동화 타달을 줘지 탈비고 고바토에 돼 유세고 말에 내 심지어 탐적이 되는 산조 고바토비 중 유세고 말와스 지사 되니기 냠는 지역이 돼봐 냠는 집부 don다 첨부 주비에 don다 첨부 탈도 근데 산조 고바토에 된 딜레 채워줘요 말에 딜레는 탈비고 고바토에 띵이 되와 토가 딜레 지금 원 내가 탈비가 성문요고 봐도 디기 주야 디규리 마사바디 델레스를 된다 시해줘요 말에 이냥아들이 디된다 첨부디게려 제바지 냠는 마제바지 로기고 말 로마게 되네기 냠는 지리가 삼마마기리 되네 냠는 지역이 냐 취라 미죽세데 냠는 지고 말에서 제가 디 냠는 지리가 삼로마게 완자 아니 냠는 지고 말에서 제가 디 냠는 마제바자 냠는 지리 삼마마게 와도 가르치 지거스네 제가 시에게 삼코고 말 가르스는 시야 삼코나 아니 가르스는 시나 오다 끼와치마 하와기게 나선께는 디아고면 데레 야가지고 우두선 비게 답시 지그로 봐 제가 디 시와 삼마코와제 세디점이 디기르비하게 강하세 탑름자야 삼코여도 니 지위에 삼는 마코 데니 지위에 삼마코도 인치발이야 문지게 죄주비 냠는 지에 삼는디 용거 봐 듬발리고 봐 듬발말레도 죄님 지고 말해지 다 딩한테 다 녀바시도 용디에서 왔다 디 마제바나 제가 먼저 치와 맞은 바이나 제가 디 먼저 냠는지 두고 말 디 냠는지 마tum나 마즈리베 단다 첨부 두게 된가서 라고 말와 디 용을 해서 녀바레서 녀바다 용세 디시고다 디 녀바레서
And the text continues, a mind analyzing meaningful goals such as future lives, liberation, and omniscience will not arise. Thus, no opportunity will be created for engaging in Dharma. So Lama Tsongkhapa is writing, here is the fault of continuing to be deceived by this implicit belief that we will not die anytime soon. This implicit belief that we have still a tremendous amount of time before us. The fault of that is that we do not accomplish much in the way of virtue because our mind remains narrow, focused on achieving these temporary minor pleasures. And our minds also focused on and often overwhelmed by also temporary, insignificant problems. That's where our focus is. So even if we attempt to accumulate virtue, it's weak because our focus is not on achieving causes for excellent rebirths or the causes for liberation or enlightenment. We're just focused, or primarily focused, on attaining minor, temporary pleasures and overcoming slight and temporary problems. And in this way, the potential of this precious human rebirth is once again not achieved. and it's us who suffers a grave loss.
And this the nigga some of the Yorimichi cho some of the Shukche, your Chesa, Chivi, some of Mahorji, Michi, some of the Yobanza, Digiton and Anzulia, City Digi, City some Digi to Dumase Aliada, Manzuki, Legalea, the negative Mango to do Sigor, as the Sungorba. That is Sungoya Jimmy adding as how good some reading some now Corsigua. Says that how good was now good, why in a jingo mother. Some cool matter. That's what the dance down to go, but then how good this the nigga a chickens and be some loge yore. And they did matches, I matches as some cool days and the uncle and the gains then said it to be a duma said like a delegate and legal water. The answer the how go over. Says that the how go over just a the game, but not how over that the nigga some of the part, but the and it's a dism you don't dalia, Yanya some day no tree, but you but how that the hour some big answer. Delay how much your mother subject, Edina, the citizen that Lagalada, Chickilaka Delia Wore, and Lagadilla, she in Masona Dennis Jam Wore, and the Jawara said the Lagale, the she in the Wore said, and the Jig Garsore. Dile Geshe Thubten Masona Jilole with the Yagadi didn't go and magic gender Chevane and the nation of Kores, the Nigga Jilly, the Green Bahama watching around to get Dile how about your mother and be some nothing onto that dear to rather. Says Andy, sometime I did you in the hair said down to some now year by the DT, some cold to us. This some called the Dicania, some dollar, you in the us. The Chimborago, yes, it pa until this modern and Gorwada.
So this underlying belief that we have that whilst we know, yes, of course, we accept we will die, but we do not believe that we may well die tomorrow or even today. The fact that we live throughout our life, right up to the end, believing, no, I probably am not going to die anytime soon. Because of this, our mind remains dominated by achieving this life's minor, temporary pleasures. And moreover, being excited when we do so, thinking that we have achieved something of value. And thereby, our mind is constantly directed towards achieving these pleasures, believing they have great value, when actually they have no great value at all. But because of this confused ignorance, we place a value onto something which it just does not possess. But because of that, we strive for it. We put our energy into achieving it. And when we do, we think we've achieved something worthwhile, something that we can stand up and show off to others, excited by what we've achieved. But it's really just another expression of our delusion. And so too on the side of overcoming problems. We place negative values on something greatly exaggerated to the actual negativity there. And in this way, we keep deceiving ourselves. And instead of achieving something worthwhile in this life, fulfilling our potential, this life gets wasted once again because of remaining blind to our potential.
Denigi, and the meaning of the Shigri and the Shigri said that some of the Minshi was thinking about that. The name of Picture or Sunchilami, Masunchen, other disorderly out, then the rest being at the Ratration Gulova. Says that Yama has been a Tavachian. Says that Mazukaram Sunjero, Sunju, and the Mahales and Jelia and D. 여름중에 some 하나 찍버리셔서 여름중에 some 하나 찍버리셔서 같이 relane 네 하고 되기 차상 결혼식 시에 승부도 사. 네 하고 아이고 하고 교도 차상 승부도 사. 네 삼다나 지그리 말하셨어. 나 양지 디디레 마치 소스 넘유도 열등 가서 넘유도 하고 뭐 말와 전수당 말. 양지 딘마 송주나 디디레스도 소스 어디에 디르서 전수 세용으로 와. 어디 디레레서 밀리고로 봐. 제자데 네 삼다나 양지 사다 지버하셨어. 제가 네가 하고 어디 양지 승부도 사. 제가 여름지기 나등 안주 가서 내 안주를 미시 샘베 삼 시기 말 시기에 샘베 삼 여러와 제가 등 안주 넘기 댕겨 말와 답변이 마다 되 넘기 시기에 샘베 마송여도 어디 해서 배 안주 뭐네 해서 댕기로와 안에 게디칭 해 봐요 말 샘베게 디야 어디 해디 된데로 왔음 그러와 제가 안는 아주 시에 삼마다 게디나 디기 두에 체디게 자와래가 짱야 지고서 어디 해서 그러와 제가 디 라트고로 마송데 라트고 디에서 딩고로 제가 양제도 송요데 소수게 삼로나 라트고로 지도 아니 삼다나 양 삼도 뭐 하고 어디 차상 양 무슨
This recognition that we will all eventually die is something that we all accept. And when we hear that, hear this in teachings, that yes, we will all die, we easily accept this. And the great fault in the way we tend to interact with teachings is when we're hearing something we've heard before, we just hear it again, and it doesn't touch us, it doesn't penetrate us. So, for example, you can attend His Holiness's teachings, and as many of you have been receiving teachings for many years, so you'll receive the teaching from His Holiness, and you'll think, oh, I've heard this before, yes, it's true, yes, it's true, and you'll accept everything because you've heard this all before many times, and you may well end up thinking, I've got nothing to learn from His Holiness, I know what He knows, because everything He's teaching, I already know.
Dina shiri jisang zu malo de jisang zu chiwas chigre sembe samlu yores ane ina da chimi chig mare sanye shig ma dirin shi sanye shig mare samlu de yores di yoran az hawo gores jisada ne dane dinige samlu thone az le chidi di yu ya de tunga se de la mong le gores jisang az shin gores ma shi wa kai mina se jerim songge chasang az shin az hawo ge chasa shi de sembe de ziro jisada de zo az dine yores 신거를 이나디 교인 받은 거 하고 두고 말다. 디소다 말은수도 디소 교인에 디냐야 삼동된 가서 경침부라고 그래서 경가르라고 그러서네. 제와치 먹문디고 고방주에게 유 사교 말에서 지교 말에서 한 탈비 고방토비아토에게 람냠내리 바치고 말에서 산교 고방토비절 냠내리 바치고 말지 마제바디 삼로디네 그냥 코르도에 디파 집제 파까제 디 최냠내제 삼로디 두고 말. 제저디 교인에서 왔다.
So I'll share this with you, and I really ask that you keep it in mind, not just for this talk, but for all the teachings, especially those of you who have been in the Dharma for many years. Because what we're seeing here, you may well encounter throughout this text and have encountered up to now. You hear the presentation, you've heard it before, and you accept it. You accept that this is true. So in this case, yes, I will die. And I also, not only do I completely accept that I will die, I also completely accept that the time is uncertain. It may well be tomorrow. It may well be before the end of this class. I accept there is that probability. And I also accept that up to this point, that understanding hasn't been dominant in my life, and I've lived a life of following desires for temporary pleasures and trying to overcome minor problems. I accept all that. And I accept the fault that presents, what we're seeing presented here, that therefore I haven't given rise to a determination to transform our mind, a determination to strive for liberation and enlightenment. All of this I accept because I've heard it many times before and I've thought about it. And that's as far as it touches you. So I encourage you not to let that happen again, but rather to take what Lama Tsongkhapa presents as personal advice for you and recognize that if all this has been heard, but the beneficial result hasn't been attained, then this has only up to now been understood, not realized. Therefore, follow the advice as it comes in the way that is presented, so that you engage in these reflections continuously between now and our next classes, and in this way to come to transform your understanding of the topic into a realization. In other words, to your very way of thinking being transformed. That is the purpose of what Lama Tsongkhapa is presenting here, not a mere a presentation of information, but rather guidance in how to transform your mind. The reason the topics have not been realized, but merely understood, is because especially these foundational topics, which these are presented in a specific sequence, these have not been realized yet. And the way to do it is only then adding one more step. If you already have the information, then keep thinking about it again and again and again, both in formal sessions such as now, but also whilst you're going about your daily life, thinking about the certainty of our death and the uncertainty of its timing, recognizing that we not only will we die, but it could come at any point. In this you can role play with thinking of how would it be if you knew with certainty that this was your last, for example, weekend. How would you use your time? How would you direct your mind? Would it be on these various activities and distractions, or would you let go of them? And one can recognize that by cultivating this sense of the impermanence of our situation, that one will be very focused on our next rebirth. Again, one can role-play and fantasize that if one knew that this was one's last weekend, knowing then at the end of it, one would be in a new rebirth. One would be thinking about, what kind of rebirth will I get? What will follow this life? And ensuring that one cultivates excellent causes for one's next rebirth. This certainly is what one would do. And this is the outcome of this meditation. Developing a mind that understands what's important, and not merely understands that, but it keeps that at the forefront of one's mind, so that all one does is focused on accumulating causes that will lead to excellent rebirths, progression towards liberation and enlightenment. And it's in this way that we develop an antidote to becoming distracted to mundane pleasures and problems. And we rather develop a mind that is wide and expansive with a far-sighted outlook. This is the antidote that is being referred to at the start of this paragraph. This antidote of having a deep understanding of the impermanence of this life is how we will fulfill the potential of what remains of this life. How we will not let this life be another life where we do not realize its potential. This could be the life that changes the continuity of lives to come.
Yeah, that in yang do sin in ma kyun jik den shore so da den bina zo yala chesum gomba so la shu kyang che di zam ji che du so ne ge wa ji ji tu chung xin de yang ni ju di du nan ja wa ju bie ngan de ju da ma de ba ko no.
Lama Tsongkhapa then continues. Even if you engage in hearing, thinking, and meditating for 100 years, whatever virtue you do will have little power because it is done for the sake of this life alone. Since you will engage in them in conjunction with faulty behavior, bad actions, and downfalls, it will be rare for them not to be mixed with the causes of lower rebirths.
Yala said, Geshe said, Chesum Gosun Jevena said, Young Capri, La Capra, Galakazam, Zamna said, Kupore, Zinagasia, Duzuki, Manzuki, Mangura, sometime, that be new Rochipu, that the tell Yala Sopa, Yala, the Capri, some Duangazuki, Turbajana, and Sambo combat in Niki, Chesum did Lega Chero Jevena, and so Yala, Chesum Sopa, Shuka, the Nechevena. Jenayang and the Anzuki, Mount said this am Chidu Songo, said he, so she get Setigi and Damya Dayoya, and said he and La Jawalam Doyoya, and J. Dushin, said he, Bene, that Benichuki, Turbacheda, Sambacheda, Setigi, she and some Jayara, some Dajor, or Dangachi Church at the show, she thinking Milia, she and Dushin, Nanjinga. Jilaga to Gisipite, so Suki, she young some diet, the Tonya, she Turbacheda, the next some Chai will see there. The name Anyanti, the Nigeria, Sosugi, Citizen, Sosugi, Damyanda, Yonada, Sosoli, Yingorioya, Sosuga, I did the washing to pay operation, get a child, don't do some touching of Manche, the nigger some lady, Chesna Capri, Lemanzuka, Caprelia, the nigger Tresam Gomsumrachi, the name Jebinayang, and the Samnodi said Disem Chidu Song, said Disem turned out to be a Damyan Dayoya, and so you turned out to be a and the Dusine, and some diet on the jail do that the Gawad Be Chunchun, which gave us at the Sagor, the Gawad Be gave a Gawad Gigi, two Chunshins, it's not Garcia, but the Danish Chad, Gawad Be, New Chunchun, Chunchun Madio Malesi.
Even if you engage in hearing, thinking, meditating for 100 years, so we can take this to mean if one were to engage throughout an entirety of a lifetime, but one does so without having gained this initial realization which opens the entirety of the Dharma to you, you will continue to have a mind that is dominated by achieving the pleasures of this mere life and overcoming this life's mere problems. Therefore, one's endeavors in hearing, reflecting, and meditating will be dominated by an underlying wish to be thought of in a particular way. For example, for others to have respect for your knowledge or for the time you've spent in retreat. These are mundane concerns, but these are going to be mixed in with your underlying motivation. And what this means is that all that energy and time that you did place in virtuous endeavors will have a far weaker result because of the weakness of the underlying motivation. Even if you engage in hearing, thinking, meditating for 100 years, whatever virtue you do will have little power because it is done for the sake of this life alone.
semjan tamje shenjen kwani samda semjan tamje gi donda sanjo 고방 토벌 지이세비 굴로 디토네 당 기회냐면 지고 와다 터지 약셔데 근데 되네기 맞아 보이네 거기 동안 타달로 저구도 새벽에 타버더니 선비군데 아직 개와지고 봐 냠네 지고 봐다 난 되네 제주마는 개와치면 언제 고방시 토고 하다미고 개와치마 나송의 동안에 타지 언제 고방 토고도 선비 되니 디군에 나제 굴로 디네 토네 가지고 단지 개발 제바이나 단지서 언제 지금 아주 기본 치료 중심기 계획이 냠는데 뭐네디 니버여 받 차르고 봐 진짜 니네 삼매 바지 세딜이야 소소게 느껴라 침보 차야 은소소 유명 약보라야 소소래 인고라야 약보라야 니네 은세디 소소라는 게 아직 donda rubiage donda dinegi jinjewe jinke kunlo dinesi setisam yu kunlongi tone jige kewa rubeine kewa be nyube chunjore so da din donda disumwa.
So just first, as the translator is saying, with each of these paragraphs, it's presenting a different fault in the Tibetan, the outline, so it's very clear. But just bear that in mind, because now we've moved to the third paragraph on the page, so it's presenting the third fault of 5, which are actually listed. So now to continue with what Gen is saying. So what's being presented here in this fault is a further fault of not being aware of the impermanence of our life. Is that we remain focused on this mere life, not thinking beyond this life. So even when we engage in virtue, our motivation is principally, perhaps even solely, about this life. So we know the motivation for the Dharma should be a motivation beyond this life, the very best being to alleviate the suffering of others, in particular, to lead them to complete freedom, to become a Buddha, so as to lead them to complete freedom. And if one cannot generate that motivation yet, then the next best motivation is a determination to gain freedom for oneself from samsara and attain liberation. And if one isn't yet ready for that motivation, to at least have a motivation to attain a good rebirth. But what we see with each of those 3 motivations is they are beyond this life. But unless we gain this initial realization, actual realization, our motivation will remain on this life. We'll want to be thought of, we'll engage in virtue with a hope of being thought of in a particular way, putting extra emphasis or exaggerated emphasis on what people say to us, how they act towards us, and so forth. And the result is, the time and energy we put into accumulating merit results in merit, but much, much less than could have been achieved if we had realized the impermanence of this life. The companion to this is when we engage in virtue, not only will that virtue be weak, but that virtue will be mixed with faulty, with non-virtuous motivations. And therefore, whilst engaging in virtue, at those times we will also accumulate non-virtue. This is in the next sentence. Since you will engage in them, so virtuous activities, in conjunction with faulty behavior, bad actions, and downfalls, it will be rare for them not to be mixed with the causes of lower rebirths. So not only will the virtue that we accumulate be weak, but we'll also still be accumulating non-virtue. So what's being expressed here is that when one engages in virtue, but if one has not gained realization of the impermanence of this life, one's motivation will be mixed with the eight worldly concerns. So these eight worldly concerns are four that are mixed with attachment to gain, pleasure, praise, and fame, and four of aversion to loss, pain, scorn, and disgrace. So of these, what is particularly dominant or particularly common in terms of when one is engaging in virtue is attachment to reputation and to praise. So two of the eight worldly concerns and their opposites, aversion towards scorn or ill repute. So where this may, to give an illustration to see how the 2 points of this paragraph are made, is, for example, if one is teaching the Dharma, but without having gained realization of this impermanence of life, one's motivation will be mixed with the eight worldly concerns. So teaching the Dharma is, of course, a virtuous activity, but one will be teaching with a motivation that is mixed with wanting to be liked, caring for one's reputation, and so forth. And therefore, this will weaken the quality of one's motivation. So whilst one will accumulate virtue when, for example, teaching, that virtue will be far less than if one was genuinely teaching with a sincere wish to lead others to enlightenment, for example. So the first fault in this illustration of teaching Dharma is that one's virtue is weak. The second fault then, or the companion fault, is after the teaching, if one doesn't feel sufficiently appreciated, or if one is not thanked in a way that you believe is sincere enough, one may well have a negative reaction. One may express that or just feel it. But this leads to the accumulation of non-virtue. So therefore, one engaged in a virtuous act, accumulated some virtue, but not that much, not as much as otherwise could have been, and then also accumulated non-virtue. So this then we should recognize as being a likely fault, a fault that we will incur in other ways, and therefore strive to not continue to be deceived by believing that this life will last. Another illustration is when helping someone, so with a generous attitude, you're giving of yourself to others. So this is virtuous. But then if afterwards the person does not thank you sufficiently, does not show what you consider sufficient appreciation, you may well get upset and then accumulate non-virtue. Therefore, look for and recognize these 8 worldly concerns in your own mind, the attachment to gain, pleasure, praise, and fame, and the aversion towards their opposites, loss, pain, scorn, and disgrace. And be on guard against them, because their grave danger is that they both weaken our virtue as well as lead to the accumulation of non-virtue. And weakening our virtue means that we do not accumulate causes for higher realms, rebirth in the high realms, or for liberation or enlightenment, because our mind is largely dominated by this life's pleasures and problems. On the other hand, though, if we do cultivate a genuine motivation to sincerely help others in the most meaningful of ways, then with such a motivation, absent of the 8 worldly concerns, there will be no need for praise or thanks. And if one receives praise or thanks, one will not grasp at that. One won't value that as being something of importance. So too, if one is not praised or thanked, one will not grasp at that either. One will not see such a response as being of any meaning at all. And in that way, one's motivation stays pure, unpolluted by the 8 worldly concerns. And that means that same act leads to so much more merit being accumulated, and the merit that is actually directed towards attaining enlightenment or liberation or rebirth in the higher realms.
Danine galdiye sam jidin chima la mine drubdu chukyang chine drubo nyembigi chishögi lelo ko minusing ni mudang jeme tamna sadung soge namyengi du dawe zomba chembi chujindu druba miwongos.
The next paragraph. Even suppose you were to practice with your focus on the next life, you will not be able to stop the laziness of procrastination that thinks, I will do it later. A great joyous effort of practicing properly will not come about as you while away your time with drowsiness, pointless chatter, and distractions of food, drink, and the like.
Geshe galdi jidin chima la mine drubdu chukyang that gewa chima ondio koba togudu sada biche tarbe komara togudu sembe samda jewan jogi dene chero jeba ina so galdi jidin chima la mine chechi druba ina ya dene ke da kabra ji gorwa dene jeba ina ya ane delya ane jiga chine drubo nyambige da benjinada gewa ondio koba togudu ane je nyamlen jaju sem nyamlen jeodu tarbe koba da langejo di yokomudu sembege samlo korache dine kabre kablasin ada jema diwa da geli jema diwa da nga lega di chago de dinyel di san di jel chigina sambe dushene chine drubo nyembege chishwe jebena lelores de lelo ko nyugo ma di goya ko minu bara nga zo le di kanga shu yungo de je di ro da nga zo da di nga di ya sambar di chi go di chago de nyela di di chi tu go di chi do go ya sa di da jema diwa chigin se ko gewa chimage samda야다 원료 고바도게 냠는 제고도 섬고래 근데 탈바 토고도特别 냠는 지긴 섬고래 이나다 어다디 지게 나디가 직 뒤수용다데 제마 지긴 섬 다디 되었는데 님이 지긴 되는 되었어 다니 한 디리노 삼말 제마 지긴 섬 두스나 가지고 치슈 지제데 레로 자와 치슈기 자와 레로세 레로 이와 제산 디 레로디 고야기 가서 고야래 빼깔래 하고 고니고 말해서 고민이신 사실 좀도 chine drubo nyembi chishwe ye lelo yuko mini shingse.
So this point then presents that even suppose you were to practice with your focus on your next life. So here one has heard teachings and recognized the need to accumulate causes for a good rebirth, or perhaps one sees our need to gain liberation from samsara in its entirety, or even I should strive to become a Buddha for the sake of others. So one receives teachings, and sometimes one's reading a book or does a meditation. But one has not yet gained this initial realization. The problem is, the line continues, we will not be able to stop the laziness of procrastination that thinks, I will do it later. So you may have a great interest in developing bodhicitta or realizing emptiness, and sometimes read on the topic, sometimes meditate on the topic. But it remains something you do sometimes, in other words, sporadically. And the reason it remains sporadic rather than continuous, in other words, in regular daily meditation and kept in mind throughout the day, the reason it remains sporadic is laziness. And this laziness of procrastination is where we leave it for another time. We leave it for when our life, for example, is not so busy, or when our particular responsibilities have been fulfilled. And in this way, we keep putting it off. And another laziness, the laziness of being attached to all these activities, this busyness. Whereas this busyness, this following this busyness, this too is an expression of laziness. Laziness that keeps one away from the Dharma.
이상 되네시에 치슈지가 다 치슈 맞아베나 가브리는 것들이 다 지체는 마치 그 니후야다 뒤수 니후 뒤수 망보치네 이 취지야 공부라고 말해서 니후 되네야 제 니후야다 무보세야 제 니모는 엽도라지 제 되네게 터네 난지게 낙톰도라지 엽도라지 디토네 안냠네 지야 말아봐 아니 아직 가브리 뒤수유리는 그냥 아직 데메 땀세던 다 쓴다면 도고님도 계시에 도심 뒤에다 뒤수 망보되는 기고래 제네 데메 땀다 근데 사도도 하세요 지금 그런데 사야 동야지 제자 칼라사야 칼라스야 돼서 동야서야 되는 뒤수 망보 두고로 어두지는 남의 두시네 아니 뒤수 조로 그래서 이제 저게 남의 뒤다위에서 제가 당아서 님의 질레서 당아서 취임이잖아 데려서 제제 아다 저에 대해서 되어서 제제 아다딩아 내가 디죠 아다디죠 디지 도서 비제티 제일지어 왔으면 샤샤 줘야 직주시 당아서 취체에 뒤스들 지켜고다 먼저 취약한데 시기도 뒤스까지 시기를 내가 되어서 냠는 제외네 뒤스지에서는 아니 망고지는 니후에 뒤스 망고지 자고로 와제래 님이 주진이 주스 삼다면에 채나고 예진 파 니후제는 디지고 말스 뒤스 철라지도 거래서 취지하면 안 되네 아직 나 가브리엘은 빼 nhập 도라 차제 되네게 지금 도시네 뒤스도 저로 거래서 야 되네게 나는 칼라사야다 은쇠야다 자동야다 조공님도 기시야다 도시는 뒤스 저로 거래서 제가 아니 가브리엘 소소를 내가 디차니엘 디차고도 som다 제가 아주 님이 주신이 som다면에 내가 뒤스 기 최제 뒤스 빼 뉴뉴뉴 시우시마도 뉴뉴마도 요 말해서 그렇다 제가 되네 얘기자 바 남면 전 디제고 남면에 파 뒤수 소하시네 제가 먼저 전주 배지 첨부지는 냠는 지투고 말해서 제가다 뒤대비 전부 첨부 주진도 두번 미워 제가 전주지 배지시네 뒤 근데 지금 근정부 냠는 지투에도 용고 말해서 냠는 제베네 됐마도 용고 말해서
The result of this is, as Lama Tsongkhapa continues, a great joyous effort of practicing properly will not come about. And the reason it will not come about is then presented in the last part of the sentence. As you while away your time with drowsiness, pointless chatter, and distractions of food, drink, and the like. This is really very true. So when we look at how our lives have been spent, we see how this is precisely the case. How much time of how many years of this life have accumulatively gone to resting our body and mind through sleep. Many years have gone in that way. Then, in terms of our waking hours every day, how much of that is in a state of lethargy, where we, for example, we may have free time, but we just don't feel like engaging in the Dharma. Maybe our mind is a bit heavy, a bit cloudy, or we just aren't in the mood. So much of our available time, our waking time, goes to that. Then there's this expanse of time that goes to sustaining this body and life through cooking, eating, exercising, and so forth. And then another large chunk goes to various expressions of entertainment with friends, with devices, and so forth. And what does that leave us with? Not much, if any, time or mental energy. So this is our lived experience. This is the reality of our life thus far.
that this week Karishini Kyun Chavares in Chizanda Deji Nanzugi, Chiwa Madimba, Namching Eme Madimbi Kyes or that. This is Chiwa Nashi Ruri Sembe Samdana, okay, teaching Eva Yomada Sembe, Chiwa Jambana, Chiwa Namching Eme Jambaina, and this week Magic, this week Levadi, Namchi Chiwa Madembada, Namching Eme, and the Mademba is other Jema wasn't Dushin, Chishin Chabores. Is that Getting Eva Yomada said, the science and getting Eva Yomadani, didn't imagine the science the best assets and be some Jiran Yovana, on dinner, could shoot that in the Jago Copra Yamachiko, Timbakigores, is not this Chaza, Guinness, Guindigipa, water in it in the Guindis, at the Morrison Dana. Then when there is Guindigipa, Nimbo the Yaman Jedi, on ma, Sugar, Sungur, then my surely this is my could Jesus. Sugar, is that is so Lucian and Namching Eme some Nache, and Dinigi, or the Kiddishing Eva Yomata, did Dinga, Dingy, Jema, Zilia, Church, Jiggins, Patayals, and these Church Mala, Paradishis on the Pesagriva, Dinner Samje, is the Namjing Eme some Dana, Disupa, Church, that the ranch egg to need to be is what. Is that down to give. This is Namjing Eme some Mata. Tinga to look on by your mother, Timakum begging as a church, Yamajeti, Pa Church, Debayunaya, and the Chishu chair, the Lelo, the Ligo, the Edge, the Zuki and the Essence.
As we see in the middle of this paragraph, if we want to actually give rise to a great joyous effort, the way to do so is be mindful of death. Because again, where we are in the text is looking at the fault of not being mindful of death. And the fault is that a great joyous effort of practicing properly will not come about. But all of you, you want to have this great joyous effort. So how to get it? Be mindful of your death. And be mindful of the uncertainty of your death. So here, mindful means to be aware of the potential of your death and that it may come at any time. How would it be? How would my focus be if I knew this were my last weekend? How would I spend my time? If this were to be my last weekend, my current project that I'm busy with, I would have to end up leaving it uncompleted. Would it really matter? Whereas my need to accumulate virtue for good rebirths, to progress towards liberation and enlightenment, that would be unfulfilled. Which of these two really matters? So we need to see these faults of not being mindful of death so as to give rise to a determination. I need to develop this mindfulness, this awareness of the certainty of my death and the uncertainty of the time of my death, so that guides what I value, where I put my mental focus, how I approach whatever it is that remains of this life, and not be deceived by laziness, whether as expressed through procrastination, delaying for better days, or laziness of following distractions.
아니네. 나도 닝보다 나서 가르송을 쓰는 마. 나는 저기 애들 디링의 시기 말에 산이 시기 말에서 가서 그래. 치워서 시기에서 삼로대 야내야도 전고 디마덴 바이네 디규에스. 안 디링의 시기 말에 산이 시기 말에 삼대디 디규에스. 진짜 될이야. 게디 치워 삼 마덴 바디 야내. 시도 그래서 삼스당 그래서. 진짜 디링의 시기 말에 산이 시기 말에 세디 디규에스. 진짜 딩아서 가르삼당 거서 오 게디칭 해봐요 말다 세베 삼당 거래지 돼. 얘네 삼당 거래서 게디칭 해봐요 말. 단 시도나 가요레스. 진짜 제다 시도나는 가서 마지로 나 계세들아 야게 깨발에는 나는 안들 깨래 하는 젠들 깨발인 게 진짜다. 지상은 젠들 깨발인 발라 근데 깨와서 그러. 진짜 이장의 깨와치마 세델이야. 언제 얌네 제방 깨와치마이네. 젠들이 대상 톱딘델이야. 咱讲你就讲明他真是什么样的这个电商不定透过身边什么大钱，你给让他来给我你们给我主播我的，电马主播这 Seti Zamji, and it Sosorana give a church and Seti Zamji Tamyanda Yata, and the next sometime they did not really such. I don't know body some down had this word, which is up. Tis a good race, she and Song, I don't know the doctor or some down was in it. They get in she was a what she would die, she would she is and some data. Nick Namching, Kitishi, never your mother, some that she went a drossa, Nichig was on the Tendril marriage, is that Dendrilla Nikito Bachi, and the then again, and I gave her to be is that I gave her Dadana to go, Mato, sign and yellow chema to be said, Kitishi never mevanza, and Logema to be said that in Shishona, Nick to her argument that in the chickens and some touch, so gave her to get that in chickens and some touch to go at the donor, that doctor, somewhat that is Chidama, Yamlin Jerin, but get ma, Jelma legal, church, but that in the to go as at the legal dinner, could that just that could do this one shall be and mobile just take. Never Demba Cabayorva.
So, I want to encourage you to reflect on as you're going home and tomorrow morning before coming here is whilst the meditation on death and impermanence will be presented still in detail, just to give the very briefest of introductions, reflect on the faults as have been presented thus far, but then use that as an impetus to then reflect on death and impermanence. So several faults, 4 faults have already been presented. Use that then as an impetus to reflect briefly on the main meditation, which is, I will definitely die. And then the second part, that could be at any time. My death is certain, my time and manner of death is uncertain. And that, in all honesty, I cannot say with any certainty whether I will even be alive tomorrow or not. I cannot say that with any certainty. Moreover, I cannot say with any certainty what or where my next rebirth will be. I know I have certain hopes and I have perhaps expectations, but they are not based on any certainty. Therefore, I have no idea, or I cannot say with any certainty, whether in my very next rebirth, I will be able to continue in the Dharma. This may well be how things are in terms of the imprints of my continuum. This may well be my last such rebirth. So this then brings us to the third key point in the Dharma. So the first is the certainty of death, the second is uncertainty of death, the third is the conclusion. So now, whilst I have the chance, I must value and prioritize the Dharma. This is where I need to place my mind. And there are certain things I have to engage with in my life, but I must do that through the lens of the Dharma. And the other things, I must see them for what they are, as expressions of laziness, of distraction. Let them go. And rather focus on accumulating causes for good rebirth. Then if it turns out I have plenty of time, this life will have been lived well. So meditate on these points. The 4 points presented already in this section, as well as then briefly, the certainty of death, the uncertainty of time and death, and therefore the need to engage in the Dharma.
Cetizamji Kulungi, Tamyanda, the negative Kulon on the Sovena, Nikawadi Nibu Chunju Mato Chayo Mares, Nyan Chesore, and the Kiwachima Ondo, the Tarpa Tamjiki Chago Mares, Initiates, Denis, and the other to do some Dabine, 나도 기디네 지금 봐 이제 레로 봐 이제 최저와 삼로 여바이네 이제 레로 원소지네 난 제마지와서야다 되니기 뒤세 봐 레로진 지수진 뒤세지 조거레스 근데 되네 가브레 니고제 뒤세 봐게 근데 아주 그 로봇한 님 기시하다 자동야다 되니기 돈 남이 마 지수 최저에 고업도 유유 마트라고 말해서 제자디 만들에 전주 신보슈 식침바치데도 말해 지내자 도스티니 디스규엔데 에세다 소디 디스만주게 만주 날래야 내가 가르가르 지기도 안서 삼로 가르가르 또 교환을 삼는 데는 코드와 교환을 내가 되는 지기도와 디 규엔에서 아주야 디겐 집지는 아주 이 최념의 야부지 두고 말해서 내 소디 규엔데 받은 거 주시고래
In your meditation, focus, whilst I mentioned the 3 points of the actual meditation on the permanence of this life, focus though, or primarily spend time on reflecting on these faults, because that is the sequence of the entire meditation. So remind or look at how that up to this point, my mind has been dominated by pursuing the attainment of this life's pleasure. And each time I achieve a pleasure in this life, whether it's a sound that I enjoy or a taste that I enjoy or a sight I enjoy, I think I've actually achieved something of some value. I hold on to that joy without recognizing its impermanence and its lack of value. So too has my life been dominated by problems. Each time a problem, whether it's hearing something I dislike, seeing something I dislike, tasting something I dislike, the reaction is not with an understanding of impermanence, but is grasping at it as having permanence, and moreover, as having a value. It does not. And the result of this is my mind has remained fixated on this life. And therefore, my mind has been narrow, easily excited, easily upset. Moreover, as I've tried to apply myself to the Dharma, I know I have accumulated merit, but I see that my mind hasn't radically transformed yet. And therefore I can recognize that what is presented here about the merit that I've accumulated, whilst I have accumulated merit, has been comparatively weak. And moreover, I also know that I also continued to accumulate non-virtue. This is because of the dominance of the 8 worldly concerns in my life, that I still remain attached to pleasure, and to praise and reputation, and still averse to loss, to pain, to scorn, and to infamy, not recognizing that all these encounters themselves are impermanent. They have no real value. Recognize this within yourself. See the fault that this has led to our life being consumed. And then adding to this is our procrastination that comes from believing we have time. Believing that as soon as I've got on top of this project, or I've taken care of this part of my life, when I look to the future, there I see a lot of time. Recognize how this has deceived us so. And that today may not only be the last day, but even if there is time ahead, right now may be my very best situation, because who knows what may come. So challenge this procrastination. And moreover, challenges the laziness of following one's attachments to the pleasures of this life. Look at where one puts one's time and one's energy, where one's thoughts go, and see how much of one's life gets consumed by entertainment, by devices, by being drawn to this attractive pleasure and that attractive pleasure. Recognize them as impermanent, and therefore having no real value, and let them go. So these then were the faults that we've looked at. So focus on these in your meditation. And thank you. Then we'll conclude there for tonight. Thank you all.